Really very warm welcome to everybody who's here this morning. I am Heather Ackroyd of Artist Collaboration, Ackroyd and Harvey, and I'm hosting this morning's session for Culture Declares Emergency. So I'd just like to explain a little bit about what we're doing and the offer. So we would also like to welcome the speakers and coordinators of this morning's session, Art Ecology Emergency, Sustaining Practice, supported by the Arts and Culture Programme at Exeter, University of Exeter. And as Kelly just said, please put your name and organisation in the chat so everyone can see who is here. I should add, we are recording the session, so if anyone would rather not appear in that, I can imagine if you've got children at home or over-enthusiastic dogs, you can turn your computer or phone cameras off, but you can still get the audio. And please also make sure you are muted. So Culture Declares Emergency is a growing global community of arts and culture champions declaring a climate and ecological emergency. The crisis compels us to imagine new possibilities and propose systemic change. We have three guiding principles: vision, that the UK cultural sector declares and takes action on the climate and ecological emergency. Our mission is to grow and support a diverse community of cultural sector declarers. Our values are to tell the truth, take action, and seek justice in the face of emergency. Culture Declares Emergency offers an online toolkit to inspire and support pledges, declaration announcements, and follow-up actions. We have designed kite marks, banner, leaflets, and sash designs. And we encourage community networking on social media and in events for declarers to share, grow and launch. Learn even. Oh, I can see it's 11 o'clock this morning at the moment. I think I need a coffee. So since its launch in April 2019, over 1,000 individuals and organizations have declared an emergency through Culture Declares. If you haven't yet declared and would like to, please do get in touch via our website, culturedeclares.org. And you can put up any questions you may have as well. So this growing network of culture declaring movements now includes music, architecture, heritage and tourism. Culture Declares Emergency works in solidarity with declaring movements globally to raise collective visibility and increase the urgency of our shared message. The offer is a response to the context of coronavirus and the devastating impact it has had on our society, and not least on the creative and cultural community. It is a space for anyone involved or interested in a cultural response to the climate and ecological emergency to gather, to question, to share, and to support each other. It will be happening bi-weekly from July, starting on Wednesday, the 1st of July at 11 AM until 12:30, and with the opportunity for evening sessions too. If anyone is interested in making an offer and leading a session, please do get in touch at culturedeclares@gmail.com or via our social media. I'd just like to add a kind of a milestone moment for us that on Wednesday, the 10th of June, Culture Declares presented its strategy for powerful, resilient and networked movement building. So we'd like to thank all of those who attended and for the enthusiastic response and feedback. Importantly, going forward, there are now 3 working groups that have been set up: strategic change making, action and events, and communications. The first meetings will take place at the times below. So next week, Tuesday, the 23rd of June, 9 to 10:30 AM, we have strategic change making. Wednesday, the 24th of June, 9 to 10:30 AM, communications. Thursday, 25th of June, the 9 to 10:30 AM, actions and events. The groups are a place for you to connect with others, share your ideas, skills and passion, and be supported to take action. So you can register to join one or more of these meetings, and Kelly will put those up on chat now. So please do join us if you can. I think it's going to be really stimulating, and we're going to be looking to create our local and regional communities. So the creative and cultural community deal with the art of the possible. Collectively, we can influence more just and sustainable ways of being, doing, and thinking. Your involvement, however big or small, is valuable and essential. And on that moment, I would like to very warmly introduce Caitlin DeSilvey. She is Professor of Cultural Geography and an award-winning author at the University of Exeter. Thank you, Caitlin. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Heather. And thank you all for being here. There's some familiar names and faces out there, and that's exciting to see that convergence. So today we're obviously in virtual space, but this event was actually originally planned for April in Cornwall. And I'm really grateful to Culture Declares for adopting us and giving us the opportunity to reimagine the symposium online. It was originally framed as a conversation about art and ecology in a time of ecological emergency, but in the moment that we're living through, this sense of emergency, I think, is heightened by a number of different events: the COVID-19 pandemic, global protests against racism, and an awareness, perhaps more than ever, that all of these things are connected with some very tough sinews, and a sense of urgency around the need for an effective ecological ethics and politics. So we're sort of leaning into this moment, although the core themes of the event are going to be carried through the two-part symposium that we're running today with the offer. I guess I want to say a little bit about how this came about and locate us in a virtual Cornwall across two Cornish collaborators, the Eden Project and the Environment and Sustainability Institute at the University of Exeter's campus in Penryn. So we know Eden as a place that celebrates plants and ecology and connection in a reclaimed China clay pit near St. Austell. The ESI is an interdisciplinary research institute focused on problems of environmental change. And academics in the ESI have been very active in leading the university's climate emergency response and are also very involved in regional conversations about a green post-COVID recovery. So a fairly activist academics going on. And Eden and Exeter have been working together since 2014 on a range of different projects. So Eden and the ESI, I suppose, are also unique in that they both work quite hard to bring together different kinds of expertise and different perspectives around art and ecology. So Eden has a contemporary arts program, themes related to environment and ecology, and the ESI has 7 years of experience hosting art science exchanges as part of the university's arts and culture program now. And some of those previous creative exchange collaborators are here with us today. This evening, we'll be hearing from artists who have worked across both Eden and the ESI, working in collaboration with researchers in the Institute and then exhibiting at Eden. So hopefully you'll be able to join us this evening for that. This morning's conversation, we framed around a very specific set of questions. We're interested in what happens when artists and ecologists meet and work together. And I think some observations from my experience in the ESI over the last 8 years is that that space of collaboration can sometimes be transformative, but it also can sometimes be tricky. And artists and ecologists tend to work often in very different fields. So using the same terms, but not necessarily with the same meanings all the time. And one of the things we want to explore this morning is this relation between research ecology, so the nuts and bolts practice of studying natural systems, and what we might call ecological thinking in a much broader sense, and which is probably best described as a sensibility rather than a set of methods. And I think it's clear that we need shared inquiry in these times of crisis, and ecology is no longer, if it ever was, a project exclusively of the natural sciences. And so we want to open out this recognition and appreciation of different ways of knowing, while also respecting difference within that, and understand what kinds of mutual exchange we might need to address emergency of all sorts. And I think it's an interesting moment to have this conversation because most of the ecologists I work with in the ESI are grounded, their field work is suspended, and many artists also are in a state of suspension and forced inward, forced online. And so maybe we have a bit more time to think about this stuff than we would otherwise. So just to give you a sense of the questions, and then I'll introduce our speakers. First question we wanted to think about today is what kind of ecological knowledge do we need to creatively navigate our way through crisis and uncertainty? How can ecological expertise inform creative practice? And then the final one, Are we all ecologists now? You know, is that the space that we've moved into? And we have two speakers with us today who I think are really well positioned to help us explore these questions, and they've been asked to respond to them. But I also hope that there are some ESI colleagues in the audience who can chip in later when we have a more open conversation. So just to give you a sense who we're going to hear from, Lucia Pietroiusti is curator of general ecology at the Serpentine Galleries in London. The general ecology program is a strategic effort by Serpentine to prototype ecological art organizations and practices. Lucia was curator of Sun and Sea Marina for the Lithuanian Pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennale, and she will be a curator of the 2020-21 Shanghai Biennale. Her current projects include The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish with Philippa Ramos and the publication More Than Human. She's also spearheading an amazing effort called Back to Earth, which she probably will tell us about, which is a gathering of over 65 artist-led environmental campaigns. And our second speaker, Eirini Saratsi, is a human geographer based at the University of Reading. And Eirini has worked with ecologists, environmental scientists, historians, and artists on a range of different research projects, really trying to get at these questions about how people interact with the natural world and how we integrate cultural and social values in environmental management. And I came across Eirini's work because in 2018, she led a workshop on arts and the artist in landscape and environmental research today. So really trying to bring together these fields, project called Alert. And this led to a report called Valuing the Arts and Arts Research, which was published in the Natural Environment Research Council Valuing Nature series. So that is our plan, is to have each of our speakers speak for 15 minutes in response to the 3 questions that I laid out. And Lucia will speak first, and then we'll hear from Eirini. And then after that, I've asked them to think about a quick response to each other's presentations before we move into fielding questions from you. And we'll do that in the chat initially, and then as we move towards the end of the session, we'll have a chance for a breakout groups where you can talk to each other in a little bit more intimately. But I'm now going to turn it over to Lucia to give us her presentation.
My name is Lucia. As Caitlin said, I work as curator of general ecology at the Serpentine Galleries in London. And in the brief minutes that I have, and as quickly as I can, I'm hoping to make a few cases to you on behalf of the intersections of art and environmental balance, environmental justice, and ecology. And in the process, I will attempt to describe something much more procedural, much more practical, in terms of how one could, or at least how I did, go about, or am doing, go about seeding a number of practices and modes of thinking about art, organizations, work, and structure that seeks some kind of longer term, more flexible, more dynamic, and definitely more ecologically minded resilience. So I would like to begin by suggesting that it may very well be that the idea of coming to terms with complexity and making peace with it, finding strategies within it that generates reparation and action in lieu of fragmentation and stasis or nihilism, that this may be one of the biggest challenges of our current time, one that in some way intersects with many of the incredible challenges and inspirational upswells that have characterized this transformative year of 2020. And by complexity, of course, I don't just mean some kind of mathematical or logical attribute, but rather the ways that, as Caitlin actually also said in the introduction, we are slowly coming to terms with a multi-species, multi-perspectival, non-homogeneous world in which intrahuman power relations, more than human interrelations, cooperations, and contradictions and frictions are all entangled and intertangled with one another. So pick up one thread, biodiversity loss, for example, and you'll end up engaging with myriads of knowledges and forms of oppression and financial transactions and so on, from the brutal practices of extractivism in those very biodiverse environments to the crucial and fundamental question of indigenous rights, reparations, and sovereignty, all the way to how that sovereignty can oftentimes articulate itself in a more than human assemblage between persons, be they humans or plants, animals or mountains. which brings with this the possibility, which is of course abhorrent to Western materialist science, that, for instance, consciousness may be a more than human thing. So are we individuals? Well, we are, in the face of an unequally distributed exertion of political violence, for example. We are in the face of our loved ones. Yet myriad of interspecies relationships are at play in the very moment that I am speaking this sentence. And it is most likely that the mood that I woke up with in today is more the product of the bacteria in my gut than of what I consider to be human me. So the I is a swarm, the planet is an organism, and the other way around. And all of those contradictory things are all verifiable things. So what does art have to do with all of this? Well, I will start with a few things that art, poetry, and imagination in general can help with in the quote-unquote real world, and then move on to a few projects that I've recently worked on or I'm currently working on. And I hope by this to suggest some kind of a practice that thinks about methodology and subject matter, about commitment and the ways of going about that commitment as one and the same. And another way of saying it is about metaphor and material as one and the same, and that seeks some kind of new agency within this. Now, the caveat here is that many of the projects that I'm about to show below or kind of loosely talk about are already the product of the intersection of artistic thinking and other fields and knowledge systems, from ecology, geography, science, architecture, archaeology, and so forth. So in a way, they already bring together this messy, sticky relationships that Caitlin, you mentioned at the beginning. So here's some things that we're really, really good at. Legal and other fictions. So invited to present case files for an international law case about a dramatic case of forest fires that were ignited in Indonesia in 2015, the group of researchers and artists, forensic architecture, began to look into the possible legal frameworks and frictions within which such an act could be, such an act could be serious enough to be tried at international level. The fires, which were connected to deforestation for the purposes of oil palm plantations and to collaborations between government and international agro-business, resulted in few human deaths, but the displacement and/or death of an enormous amount of orangutans. Now, through reflecting on this fuzzy and unstable boundary between human and non-human in a legal framework, the artwork and the research project and the activist project within the Ecocide project posited the fires as murders rather than crimes. In their exhibition and performance project Offsetted, the spatial practitioners duo Cooking Sections turned their attention to the way in which New York City trees are turned into quantifiable financial assets through the practice of carbon offsetting. Within such ecological and economic system, over 678,000 trees provide more than $100 million worth of, quote, environmental services per year. A critique of the financialization of the environment over, say, the reduction of carbon emissions, the project reflected on the personhood of trees, proposing legal strategies for the trees to enact their rights, in Cooking Section's term, quote, not to serve as carbon offsets, allowing them to just be trees. So, metaphors and other material things. Last April, I co-curated an event called Plant Sex, which was a very art-led event looking at erotics and botany. Part of the exercise here with Plant Sex was to travel back to very early abstraction, by which very early poetry, and bring them back together with that knowledge of plants and agriculture that these works conserved like an archive passed on through the generations. This is an excerpt from the Song of Songs from the 3rd century before BCE. That day, you seemed to me a tall palm tree, and your breasts the clusters of its fruit. I said in my heart, let me climb into that palm tree and take hold of its branches. And oh, may your breasts be like clusters of grapes on a vine, the scent of your breath like apricots, your mouth like good wine. Though it later came to be read as an allegory for divine love, the 3rd century BCE biblical song, Song of Songs, follows in the tradition of erotic celebrations of love and marriage. The young girl and her lover, often identified as King Solomon, are in a garden. And here lovemaking is entangled with the perfumes, textures, and seductiveness of plants. But the other way around is equally intriguing. In this last passage, the king, comparing the girl to a palm tree, is also referring to the process of date tree fertilization, an agricultural practice which may date as far back as the 5th or 6th millennia BCE, and that forms the backbone of Mesopotamian and Sumerian civilization. And so in looking at this, we then are able to imagine that poetry, rather than being an abstraction from or a mythologization or religification of belief systems, may actually in fact be an incredibly practical form of very resilient transmission of memory and knowledge, more resilient in fact than all of the various technological forms that we are kind of toying with today. So if we take Donna Haraway's dog Cayenne or Anna Tsing's Matsutake mushroom in The Mushroom at the End of the World, these are more than human beings that accompany their human authors and their texts as both life and thinking companions. To think with, as Tsing reminds us in that book, is to practice a direct observation of the thing, the being, or the landscape, in her case the mushroom, in itself, whilst at the same time appreciating the mutually reconfiguring relationships that they hold with others, the process of becoming that is intrinsic to a more than human relationality. In many examples of contemporary radical anthropology, more than human thinking and so on, more than humans travel through text and thought simultaneously, both as subject matters, as in existing within the frame, the thing I'm talking about, but also crucially as structuring principles, as in existing as the frame themselves, the thing that allows me to talk or to think in the first instance. So they are symbols and they are also ontologies, and they are both at once. And here, the suggestion is that thinking or working ecologically, thinking and working and writing more than humanly, brings with it an invitation, which is that of holding more than humans' material and earthly existence together with the strategies and methodologies that emerge from them through their potential symbolic or poetic abstraction. In 2018, together with Filipa Ramos, we began to prepare an interdisciplinary symposium series which brought together artists, anthropologists, scientists, and musicians around the question of consciousness in a more than human landscape. We titled this The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, and I would like to briefly, very briefly, pause to tell you a little bit about this title as a meeting point of this circle, the material, sandy thing that is the circle itself, and the symbolical or representational extrapolation that emerged as in the series of events. So the questions that we were asking ourselves about this fish, this circle that we look at and think, oh, it's a work of art, it's an image, but the fish kind of experiences as a form of movement. It does this little, the fish is tiny, you can see it there, it does a little dance and then makes this beautiful shape. Was really, how does the fish embody this circle as a movement inside of its mind? What is the shape of the circle in the mind of a fish? Is an in the middle of viewpoint something that acknowledges the utter and total immersion of the human self with all of its abstractions within a complex material set of ecosystems, a necessary prerequisite for the development of a deep ecological sense of self? And how does that translate into programming or curatorial practice? What are the conditions of possibility that make a dance, a pickup line, a mound of sand, a geometrical figure, a mathematical formula, and an artwork so adherent to one another that they might reveal themselves to be the same? And how to look at something, as in the intersection between disciplines, in a fuzzy enough way, as the architect Keller Easterling says, with eyes half closed, or without my glasses on, so as to encounter similarity much, much earlier than differentiation. So General Ecology was a project I wrote for the Serpentine between 2017 and 2018, during and just after my maternity leave, following on from research about ecology and the environment that had begun with the Extinction Marathon Festival that we had organized at the Serpentine together with artist Gustav Metzger and artistic director Hans-Erik Obrist. The basic idea for General Ecology was to reach the infrastructure of the institution via the medium of the curatorial, in order to embed ecological principles, research, and methodologies throughout the whole of the galleries. Some images are missing. There you go. So these are two of the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish moments. And now finally, with the 3 minutes left, I will tell you a little bit about one of the main things I'll be doing over the next years. I'm currently deep inside the preparations of Back to Earth, the Serpentine's 50th anniversary program for 2020 and beyond, which, almost as though it were a generalization of the General Ecology project itself, will address ecology throughout every strand of our program. Rather than celebrating escape strategies from Earth reserved for the few, Back to Earth roots itself firmly in the messy and complex realities of the ground on which we walk. So as Caitlin said, we are working on artist-led campaigns and initiatives that directly respond to the environment with projects that are both artworks and methodologies or prototypes or interventions or campaigns. They will be at once poetic, ritualistic, impassioned, and hopefully useful, constructive, reparative, and generative. And at the same time as we're doing this, we're thinking about internal transformation of the way we work together and with others, and of methods sharing, as in how to open source the entire working method and mechanism of Back to Earth for future kind of repeated use. And you see here a map that we're using, courtesy of the advice of my colleague Ben Vickers, a map that we're using to really locate all of the projects and the campaigns along some kind of a continuum that allows for some of them to be relatively invisible or non kind of audience or participatory, but audience-led or participatory, but quite infrastructurally transformative, whereas others are on the more visible end of the spectrum. So it's an incredibly complex project, of which these are some of the parts. Many parts of it might not be immediately visible. Like a garden, the individual initiatives will pop up or be latent or gestate or flower at different points over the months and the years. And at the same time, a regular podcast programming, which we started in April, is trying to think about what ecological practice means in this context. We are also launching the formalization of something that is so far informal, which is the General Ecology Network, which will be a network of art, but also crucially non-art organizations dedicated to driving artist-led systems change, convene strategies for art and ecology across the sector, and prototyping resilient futures for some kind of art field that doesn't consume, transport, travel, and so on as much as we have been used to so far. So in the current environmental emergency, Back to Earth and the General Ecology Network advocates for the implementation of small, incremental, and transformative shifts, both within the Serpentine itself and outside of it, to operationalize the activities of an art institution towards the efforts of environmental causes, climate peace, and climate justice. And I will close with two quotes that the whole Back to Earth team is particularly fond of. Bruno Latour writing, "When the rug is pulled from under your feet, you understand at once that you are going to have to be concerned with the floor." And Keller Easterling, quote, "The activist need not face off against every weed in the field, but rather unannounced alter the chemistry of the soil." Thank you so much. I've added two links, one to our website and the other one to reach the Serpentine's podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. That's wonderful, and there was a lot to think about in there. It's very, very rich. We're going to hold on questions for now, but if you have questions that are burning on your tongues, please do post those in the chat, because we'll come back to fielding questions after we've heard from Eirini. So I'm now going to hand it over to her, and we'll have a 15-minute perspective from some of the projects that she's been involved in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you everybody for hosting the event and inviting me. As Kathleen said, that it's a shame that we're not in Penryn, but I am mentally there, Kathleen. So I'll share just a moment to share this slide with you. I don't know if you can see. The only reason I would like you to see, because I have chosen to call this short presentation, to give the strange title, which I will explain in a moment. We call all trees trees, and I will tell you what that means in a moment. So I go on to try to. I will, unlike Lucia, that she gave us a very interesting presentation. I hope I will not bore you with mine. I'll try to go through one by one the questions that Kathleen asked us to think about and to respond and try to see what we have to say about them. And I will try to see them from my perspective as a human geographer. The first thing I will have to say, in order to think about the first question, what kind of knowledge do we need in order to creatively navigate ourselves through crisis? I would say that the first thing we need to think is how people understand the world first of all, and what kind of knowledge is considered to be acceptable, and by whom. And I know this is a big question about what knowledge is and how we appreciate this, but I just wanted us to think about knowledge as a culture, because culture is, knowledge is created through processes and the relationships. It comes through practices and interaction. It's not just about knowing as being able to understand something. You create this, it comes together as you go along. So there are many ways where knowledge can be produced. However, we tend, when we speak about serious issues or when we are in crisis, we tend to turn into the objectivity of the scientific knowledge. And we think that this is paramount and the one that we need. And of course, we say that, now in the crisis of COVID-19, we said we all immediately turned to the scientists to tell us what we need to do. So this is how we tend to operate. But especially if you speak about ecological knowledge, if you see what ecology is, we will say that the definition, by definition, this is the study of interaction among the living things and their environment. So this study must do it well. And I looked yesterday at the British Ecological Society to see how they define that. And under the question, why is ecology important? They say that ecology enriches our world and is crucial for human well-being and prosperity. It provides new knowledge for the interdependencies between people, nature, and that is vital for our well-being, the production of food, and so on. So what I want to argue here today, and perhaps we can go on to discuss later, is that this new knowledge, it's not necessarily only coming from the scientific process. And this is where I will come to the title of the presentation, which came years ago when I was doing my PhD on the Greek mountains, and I was going around asking people what do they know about the environment, how do they use, how they interact with the natural world, with the plants and species. And I was in a conversation with an old man, and he, I say old because this is what I was trying to get the knowledge of the elderly. And I said, I was speaking about some oak trees, and he said, oh, they are trees. We call them all trees here. And of course, by listening to that, you immediately will go, okay, this is a simplistic view, you know, we don't know. But the man went completely, again, straight to explain in great detail the ecology, how they use the different trees, and how they applied, how they treated the different trees, each of the species, they were behaving differently. And he described 8 different oak species and he named them. So the point I suppose I try to make here is that to nourish the environment, to take action, to respond to things, you don't just need to be to appropriate the right scientific knowledge, but rather I would say that we need to adopt the values this knowledge embody, and to speak about these complex relationships about nature. We need to see the knowledge coming from different directions. And to close and proceed in the second questions, I will say that this is, we can accept the knowledge from different directions, and we should be open to that. But whenever this knowledge comes, we just need to see and think about a bridging language. How can we understand what, where knowledge comes and how we can speak to each other? And we'll speak later, and I hope during the discussion to see how we can do that. So how can the second question I will move to is how ecological expertise can inform creative practices. Well, before I start, I want to complete this question because I think it's missing something. I would say, how can ecological expertise inform and be informed by creative practices? Because if we speak about relationships, if we speak about interaction, if we speak about different ways of doing things, and for surely we need to speak about mutual exchange. And therefore, I will think about this and from both ways. And I don't need to say to everybody, I hope, and all the people they listen to us today, what art can do for us. And we know what art, the transformative power of the art, and we know that it's integral to human nature. But but I want to point out that it's not just a bonus. We need to think about that. Is artistic expression and creativity is a unique capacity of humans and reflects our ability to see things how they are, but also how they should be or they could be, and change them. And to come and speak about this mutual relationship and how we can see, I want to use the metaphor of the stage lighting. When I was thinking about that, my son was doing homework about the stage lighting. So I thought, okay, this is what I need here. So I see arts and art practices as the stage lighting. That shades the light. We can see, can illuminate, it can give us, it can focus where the importance is. But art, of course, it doesn't only do that. Only that, as the stage lighting, it gives meaning. It gives, it's changing the atmosphere. It decides when the stage will start, the scene will start or will stop. It plays a very important role. And in the same way for the play, otherwise the audience could not watch the play. And if we think now what art can do, of the designer, the lighting designer, it doesn't just change the light here and there. It doesn't just switch on the switches or chooses a bigger or smaller light, art without knowing anything. It needs to know the script. It needs to know where the emotions will change. It needs to know what is going to happen in the plot in order to direct the light, in order to create the meaning of the light. And I think this is how the two work. And to come back in my original questions, what creative practices can get, it is exactly that. You know, we from ecology, we can change our way that we think about that. And of course, I don't want here to suggest that the ecological knowledge can offer the only story, the only metaphor, the art or the creative practices they can work with. Of course not, but I want to say that this is one of the story that the ecology can say, and we need it. I think for the Lucia's presentation, we see that how they, I would discuss about that, how exactly they interpret these phenomena, but for sure they build on some knowledge that they have from the ecological science. Especially, so we need them to tell us what they have to say. And then to go in the last question, Kathleen has said, I had more notes here, but I will keep them for our discussion. Are we all ecologists now? Well, depends. I think it depends here to speak, to look at what is we, what we, for who are we include in this we, because I suppose there are some of us that we are more involved, like the more general population. And the other is with what kind of ecologists do we have in mind? Do we speak about the ecological awareness, the feeling, and this, or which means that we have an obligation that everybody has to act politically sensible, take care of the environment, or we speak about this study as the scientific definition of ecology is. But I would like to say that, let's say that we speak about what ecology is as a study. And if we look again on the, if we accept the definition that ecology is a study of the interactions among living things, and then we look what study means, that we are doing a research, and we look in the definition of research that is a practice, a creative and systematic activity in order to increase the stock of knowledge. And this is another definition of research. And then we say that if everybody is doing that, if we can research creatively, systematically, actively, and we increase the stock of knowledge, then yes, I would say that yes, we are all ecologists. We can be all ecologists. And because I believe the problem is not, it doesn't lay in the value of research being undertaken, because the research and how we do things, it may be very well done in any category of the different process or different methodology we use. I think the problem is how we think what matters, and how we measure it, and how we accept it. And I come back in my initial question, we need to think how people understand the word about that, and what kind of knowledge do we accept? Do we take as acceptable knowledge? And this is a question that we will need to come back. And the question I will put to everyone, can we all do it that well? This is the question perhaps we need to ask. Can we all do this systematically and related, or we just leave it to someone to do that? But in terms of the creative practice, yes, I would agree that yes, we can do it, that we should do it. Thank you very much. I had more, as I said, but I will keep them after for the questions.
Thank you, Eirini, and thank you for your faithful response to the questions. There is also a lot to think about here, and what I'd like to do now is to try to open up the chat between you and Lucia initially, and then encourage people to begin to post questions that we could then discuss together. If you wanted to pose those to a specific speaker, that's fine. And we'll have an open chat for about 20 minutes, and then at about 10 past 12, we're going to do some breakout groups where people have a chance to discuss the questions in groups, much smaller groups. But I suppose just to kick us off, you've already posed a lot of questions out there, and I appreciate that question about whether we can all do it well, or whether there is a need for us to recognize that we all have different sets of expertise and different sets of skills in this space. And I think it relates to a question that I was actually going to pose to Lucia as well. So maybe we could start with that, which is the program that you lead is called General Ecology. And I'm just interested in how you've settled on that as the title for it, and whether you were thinking about that in relation to a more specific ecology, or whether, you know, how the term general works in that sense, and how it relates to these questions about what we do and what we do well, and what some people do but other people don't do.
Yeah, so the truth is that I had this giant book by a media theorist, Eric Hurrell, called General Ecology around, and I'd only read about 20 pages of it because it's really heavy media theory at that time, and then woke up in the morning with the notion that the project that was kind of hovering in my head should be called General Ecology. The idea, and I think it relates a little bit to, I don't know, responding, or maybe making a gesture of appreciation for some of the things that Eirini, you've just said, was always that whilst I was not scientifically, whilst I did not follow that scientific path, though having a passion for it early on in life, I was thinking about ecology at the time, both as in the context of science and biology, and in the context of systems and cybernetics. And I was trying to think of the two at the same time. And it occurred to me that in the work that I've been doing, I've been more concerned, as it happens, with what ecology does rather than what it is. And haven't really asked myself the question, nor have had that question asked to me, thankfully, enough, of what exactly it is. But when I think about it, I think of a system of feedback and of connection across distance. And if we look at things through the prism of those two principles, or at least those two principles plus others, then there's an enormous amount of generalization that can be that can emerge out of ecology into other forms of thinking, forms of organizing, institutional structures, forms of work, and stuff like this, and also forms of making politics, making society, and so on. So I was thinking about that, and then I was also thinking about the question of generalism. Like artists tend to kind of delve quite deep into a subject matter for the production of a work, but those subject matters can change over time. And as a result, they have this kind of professional and amateur relationship to things that often happens in collaboration with the quote unquote sort of experts in that specific field. And this kind of blurry vision, this half-closed eyes that Clarice Drilling mentions, interests me a lot because of a very embodied experience that I have, that when I take my glasses off, I think that everybody in the street is my friend. And I'm interested in that thing that allows us to see similarities and to approach each other with similarity in mind before we approach each other with difference, as just very simply and very pragmatically a very functioning and functional strategy for sets of achievements. I have a background in gender activism, like 10, 15 years ago. And, you know, notice that there's always big moments of great questioning and political uproar and upswell, and those are really important to kind of raise the consciousness. And at a certain point, some of the pieces fall into practically, where can we go with this? Practically, how can we align on this? And I feel that very strongly when it comes to environmental questions, environmental justice, and the intersections between all those things.
Wonderful, thank you. Eirini, did you want to pick up on any of that?
Yes, I was about what I pick up from Lucia's presentation, and perhaps he says also that it is this sense that I suspect the artists as well, they do it, where you go, you immerse in something, and then you come out, and then you look, and then you decide which bits you will keep and which bits you will let behind. But this is, I think, a process that everybody's doing. If you think about science, how science works, is doing again the same thing. We go out in the field and we look and we correct. I say we, but anyway. We collect information, and then we come back and we decide which is good or which is bad. I feel we need to look a little bit more what's this difference in when we apply the different methodology, what kind of difference this brings and where this is reflected. Because the methodologies, perhaps they may be, they are dissimilar, but in their, how to put it, in their, how they are imagined, how they are designed, they are not that far apart. We select things and we are looking in different, with a selective eye. And, but I think it's something in the creative practices that it has some different intimacy, and also it's a little bit, I don't know, perhaps Lucia can add in that, it allows more flexibility, allows more blurriness to be accepted at the end. While if we look in the scientific approach, that I'm interested in seeing where the difference is really. This is what, from my point of view, what the interesting is. Where, because as a human geographer, I'm sure Catalan would, you know that as well. I go out and I try to understand how the world works as well.
I mean, one of the things that I'm tempted to think, and this might be abhorrent to many scientists, but it might be not so much how close artistic or abstraction or imagination process is to the scientific method, but how much of the scientific method actually belongs to the realm of and the tradition of divination and therefore poetry and abstraction as well. I mean, not that it's factually incorrect, but for me, there's an enormous amount of stuff in kind of divinatory forms and in cosmologies that aren't considered to be materialist scientific, that are in fact accurate when it comes to you know, the conservation of biodiversity or the sort of renewal of soil or things like this, and that happen to work. One of the things that it occurred to me, that it did not occur to me to mention today had to do with this kind of time gap that exists in the artistic kind of offering, which has a lot to do with the way that, for example, sci-fi looks like it predicts the future because now technology objects look like those objects that we had in sci-fi novels 40, 50 years ago, but actually it may in fact collaborate to producing that future, because it might have been that those influenceable teenagers that are now designing those objects have those images in those books in the back of their minds. And so there's a kind of like putting these messages into these bottles into the future that is really interesting. And then I loved what you said about stage lighting, actually, Eirini, because I've been thinking about this from the institutional and kind of systemic standpoint of how much the performative, so like how does saying something do something at the same time, or like I think about it as magic spells as well, how they can be kind of operationalized if you have some agency in like an art organization. And so in the instance of Back to Earth, some of these initiatives are by and large really environmental interventions or campaigns, but by calling them an artwork as well, it allows for an institution that has, you know, funding related to art and audience related to art and all of this to be able to then come in support of it, or like leverage everything it's got to be able to make it possible. So it's got this kind of, you know, how can you then, what's your, one of the things that I work with a lot is like, what's the wiggle room in the thing that you do that allows you to start doing something that could be a million miles away, but, you know, isn't anymore. And you kind of need those openings on both sides, you know, you need those kinds of breaches on both sides of institutional and disciplinary divides in order to like flirt.
Can I just very quickly say something and respond to that, Kathleen, very quickly? That I like that you brought this up, Lucia, about why you said that it's an environmental really study or a project, but we name it art, and then we are able to you spoke about communicate with the arts organizations and so on, but I would like to add to that don't you think that by naming the art and by dressed it up as art, it communicates the message as well. It communicates the message to others. And we have another, Kathleen mentioned the Alert project at the beginning where we started this conversation. So now we have another project that we try exactly to come together and see how this communication, because I feel that this communication, it happens and it's good. This is, it's really what we need to harness, but it happens up to a point sometimes. And when we are about to make decisions, we're about to prioritize things, which somehow disappears. So I don't know, but I think that is one of the other points that we need to think why it stops somewhere, or it doesn't stop. I don't know, but my feeling is that it stops.
Well, yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. In most cases, it does stop. And I think that's why, for me, like the playing field is always at the level of the organizational structure or the infrastructure. Like, what are the actual budgets that you have at your disposal to do things? How long do they last? You know, can you share that budget with other organizations? How does that work financially? Like all these very, like I'm doing much more stuff that I'm not trained to do, like finance, development, like that kind of work at the moment than I ever did before, because it's kind of there that you find the little kind of granular bits of agency, like transformative agency.
I'm just going to nose in here because we do have a question coming through from our collective, but I think it's connected to something that's sort of in the back of my mind at the moment, because we've been talking quite a lot about this sort of ways of making knowledge and respecting that. And I think one thing I just want to make a plug for is that my understanding of the sort of field scientists who I work with is that they are often multiples in themselves when it comes to this kind of thing. You know, they sort of, like we've had some really fascinating conversations connected to the work that Graham did with us, and we'll hear about that tonight, around things like the novel Overstory and how an ecologist who works with plants thinks about that book as sort of an opening to another sensibility, but also an alignment with the knowledge that they're producing. But also there's often friction there because there's a sort of sense in which they don't, it's not that they don't entirely trust it, but it's sort of, it's not singular. It's I think that way of making knowledge, even within Western materialist science, is never singular. There's always this sense of these sort of multiple commitments and perspectives that you bring together in relation to any question. But I think the question that Sarah has posed is about audiences. And I think there are many ways of making knowledge, but there are also lots of ways of receiving it. And people will receive this awareness in a different way, depending on where it's being communicated, you know, who's communicating it, whether it's self-identifying itself as art or self-identifying itself as, you know, fact and information, you know, and this is, you know, that you can objectively receive. And this occurred to me when I was preparing for this event and rereading Being Ecological and thinking about the sort of way that information delivery mode is sort of demonized, like, oh, we just don't need facts, we need, but some people actually would rather receive that as well, you know, so that's, I suppose that's the question to Sarah's question, was what role do audiences play and how do we think about this reception and where does that sit in relation to the artist-ecologist relationship? Whoever wants to take that.
No, sorry, I had my mute, I was muted. Yes, I totally agree with that, because we should not discard anything, because some people understand and appreciate different information coming in different ways. So we do need the different type of knowledge. Also, I want to add another thing here, that art usually it is well, not well, it draws us in, and there is the danger there that whatever is presented as art, it can be taken, and sometimes we need to think what kind of messages are coming through through the art, or how it directs us and where. And I think this is perhaps the responsibility of those they work on that and they create. But if we think about the audience, then it is important to know to whom do we speak and how do we make other forms of knowledge available to different at the same time together, so we make sure that the audience are there, the audience, and because the audience that they can be taking away, if we just have one type of knowledge. But Kathleen to say that this can happen also with the scientific knowledge as well. If you are prone to accept this type of knowledge, then you can be able to be biased because it's just a scientific paper who says that.
Lucia, did you want to respond to that before we open it out?
Very briefly. I think I agree with Eirini on the question of different modes of knowing, and I just wanted to go back to the idea of like making peace with infinite complexity, because it has been remarked that the exponential increase in computational power, for example, is enormously draining on planetary resources, and is not actually leading to greater speed of discoveries or to a fair and balanced world. If you look at the ways in which, for example, AI, facial recognition AI is racially biased and all these kinds of things. So more knowledge, more mapping, and endless mapping results in this kind of event horizon of a one-to-one mapping of the world. And as I always say, a machine as complex as the world itself is the world. And there is no other possibility to create another one like it. And so to a certain extent, the artistic kind of abstract forms of abstraction, be they sound, piece, body work, ritual, poetry, myth, memory, toy for a child or whatever, all of those are ways of feeling not on top of and trying to map, but actually a part of, and completely entangled and therefore politically implicated in the endless complexity of the ecosystem. The other tiny thing that I wanted to say has to do with, at the structural level, because I'm always thinking at the two, at the kind of strategic level in relation to an art organization, the audience plays an incredibly crucial role of mirror and feedback. Because what happened with the General Ecology project was starting from the agency of the curatorial, like, can I program things about ecology? Yes. So you start to do that, but then slowly a community of audience members and interlocutors and artists and communities and networks and all of that builds, and they then reflect back to the whole organization, not just to myself and the team who are working on it. They reflect back an image of the organization as one that is very invested and very involved. And that then calls upon the organization to then make the necessary transformations that then make true that expectation. So there's a kind of positive, as in not positive in the cybernetic sense, not destructive, but a generative feedback loop that happens there that is absolutely necessarily happening with an audience in mind.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful reminder of something that's that Joseph, I think, has reminded of us in the chat, is that a straightforward model of reception is not that helpful, and that actually a lot of the kinds of work that we've been talking about, there is knowledge production going on through a dialogue between an audience and the artist, and between the science and the audience as well, or even the audience has been broken down completely.
But we're also audience. We're always audience, and we're also speakers and listeners in life. So it's kind of that movement between the two.
Yeah, I think, and we all have to navigate our way through often too much information. I think there's an interesting question here that I thought we'd just pick up before we break out, because I think it's quite pointed in a way, about the way that artists use data, and whether there's a sort of expectation or an obligation to try to be accurate when engaging with that kind of knowledge matter.
Mind if I very quickly respond to a couple of questions that have come up around instrumentalization? And
yeah.
Because I think it's really important. I wanted to say two things. One of them, that I'm quite fond of trying to recuperate words like instrumentalizing and manipulating, because ultimately manipulation is the stuff of sculpture and instrumentalizing, you know, you can think about the tool and the instrument, but you can also think about music and the instrument. And so how do we recuperate those kinds of things and try to turn them into generative rather than destructive things? But also the strategy for me, and I completely agree with all the points that have been made in the chat, the strategy is always to go in an artist-led way. So all of these things that I'm saying are not, as it happens, my decision for the most part at all, but more kind of emerge out of the individual kind of commitments and intentions of artists. And I just try and be the part of the puzzle that kind of fits within a larger kind of project and life, which is ultimately the life of the artist's work itself. But yes, data. I don't know, actually. Eirini, maybe you, depends.
I don't know, I'm not an artist. So.
Maybe it does depend. I mean, I have to, in
I
my own...
time. I can say for my experience of working with artists, I have to say that I can see a different way how I work and how artists work. So, but I don't know if they use data or not. But I think they do. I think they.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking about this because mostly I've encountered this when I've trying to write creatively through knowing sort of deep time understandings of climate change, for example, where I'm trying to make what I feels like an accurate statement about, you know, what carbon levels would have been 400 million years ago. And I get myself wrapped in knots because I want to say something which feels accurate, but I'm also interested in the science, and the harder I try to figure out whether what I'm saying is accurate, the more I understand how uncertain the science is. And so then I'm left actually feeling like I can't really say anything except something very provisional, because actually when you start to scratch this knowledge, it actually is, it's not coherent really. And that's a recognition, you know, even though it presents itself as data, it's internally inconsistent often, and the methods are, you know, rely on proxies that are meaningless. And sorry, I'm going to make scientists mad, but I think it is when you start to think about what you can say and how you represent this knowledge, I think it is can be quite problematic actually, to be faithful. That's all we can try and do. What I'd like to ask that we do now in these very few minutes that we have left is to just take a moment, everyone, and think about what we're going to take away from this conversation. And if you are willing to share those comments in the chat in a form of sort of collective reckoning with what's useful about this kind of conversation. Is there something that you feel like you might take into your practice if you came from sort of an ecological research perspective? Did you find what you heard interesting and useful? And we will use these comments and this feedback to help us understand how we might convene conversations like this in the future. So it's not just going into a void. So if I'm inviting you to just think about what you will take away. What I'd like to do now is just briefly tell you about what's going to happen this evening. So we have another gathering, which is at 7:30 as the evening offer, and there's a separate invitation for that, separate Eventbrite sign up. And Misha Curzon will be leading that from the Eden Project, and she'll be speaking with Bram Thomas Arnold and Sarah Bowler, and they both have this hybrid practice where they've been working in Cornwall with both the ESI and the Eden Project, and through the Arts and Culture program in the case of Bram. And that will extend this conversation, but really ground it more in the sort of art practice and the work that individual artists are doing to try and explore a slightly different set of questions. I want to invite now Eirini and Lucia to just say a few words of hello, goodbye, and then Heather is going to wrap us up. But thank you all for your time and your input into this. So I had this moment in the chat where it was like I suddenly sensed the energy in the breakout, and it was really exciting actually to be with a few people who'd come along on this. So yeah, Lucia, I don't want to put you on the spot, Lucia and Eirini, but if you wanted to, do you have anything?
No, it's okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say what I had to say. I think one of the things that I would take out that perhaps I want to explore further, it's this idea about the knowledge and how we can make sure that all kinds of knowledge, we can bring them together, and we can appreciate what do we need to do to break this hierarchy that is there at the moment, that some are accepted more and some less. And the second thing is, I would like to hear more about how the creative practices they deal with the complexity, and how can how can we really communicate a little bit better. But I think I will be there in the evening as well, and I hope I will learn more, and we'll have more opportunity to exchange ideas. And of course, to say that I will say to advertise the project as well, because I would like these conversations to continue through Alert as well, which I will distribute information in
if you could put can you just put a link to some of the information in the chat maybe while we're here? That would be great.
Okay, that would be where developing the website of the Alert, where Alert will be the network that will invite everybody that is interested in how we communicate knowledge, how we do research in this, and how we exchange ideas. They will be very welcome to come and interact there. I'm not sure if it's at the moment works well. I will put also on the chat our Twitter account.
Okay,
and,
great.
Okay,
all right.
I will add the website, but you have to be to wait a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. So Lucia, briefly, did you want to just sum up or say what you'll take away, and then we'll hand back to Heather?
Well, I was very grateful for the conversation, very brief, that we had with Anya, Chris, and Kate. So I just wanted to thank them, you, wherever you are. And then also to just say, Misha brought up something super important that I wish we had had some time to address, which had to do with the voices from the environmental movements that have been, as it were, spotlighted over the last decades, have very often come from a very privileged position of being in the global north and being primarily white. And there's some organizations that are doing really excellent work about this. And I mentioned in the chat Climate Reframe being one of them. We think about this in relation to indigenous rights and kind of community-led and owned environmental movements. Climate Reframe does a fantastic job within sort of really prodding at the history of racism that exists within environmental activist movements themselves. And then there's some other projects like Flourishing Diversity and a few others that really try to support and sustain kind of local-led and community-led, how do you say, advocacy and activism projects. So just to kind of say it really quickly, but I just wanted to thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Lucia. Thank you, Eirini. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Sarah. And just remind everybody, there will be a follow-up session this evening from 7:30. So please do go forth and book your space. It's been a really, really fascinating and very stimulating and provocative conversation and dialogue. Thank you to everybody who's participated. And, you know, as Sarah said on our little breakout session, actually, if everybody had descended onto Cornwall, which was the plan, and as we all do within our practice, we go away for seminars or for kind of, you know, whatever kind of gatherings. Actually, yes, we have saved a huge amount of carbon. And yes, although the digital does carry an inevitable carbon use, actually it is going to be less, it is mitigating. So somewhere along the line, the air is a little bit clearer. We can all breathe a little bit more deeply. And I thank everybody for sharing this. Thank you so much.